The last documentary asked one question. Is the structure at the center of Islam's most sacred pilgrimage a divinely appointed house of God, or is it a 7,000-year-old pagan ritual site dressed in the language of Revelation? So now comes the harder question in part 2, because the building is only part of the story. What about everything you do when you get there? What about the specific movements, the specific acts, the specific rituals that millions of people perform every single year, believing with complete sincerity that God Himself commanded every single one of them? What about the circling? What about the running? What about the shaving of the head? What about the stoning? What about the animal sacrifice? Where did those come from? Are they in the book that God called complete, fully detailed, and neglecting nothing? Or are they from somewhere else? And if they are from somewhere else, what does that mean for the 2 billion people performing them? Let's start with the Quran, because everything has to start with the Quran. Not with what scholars said about the Quran, not with what narrators reported centuries after the fact, the Quran itself. The word Hajj appears in the Quran as a reality, but its depth is often obscured by conventional interpretations. In the linguistic landscape of classical Arabic, the root HJJ primarily signifies the act of prevailing through argument, gaining dominance, and establishing a matter with undeniable clarity and force. To say one has established a hujjah is to say they have defeated an opposing view with facts that cannot be overturned. This intensified form used in the Quran points toward a dominance that is absolute and a system of law that stands firm against chaos. When we read chapter 2, verse 196, with this perspective, we see a command to complete this process of dominance and construction for the sake of God. This instruction does not exist in isolation. It follows verses regarding the spending of wealth for the common good and the prohibition of self-destruction through negligence. Within this framework, Hajj is the functional establishment of divine guidance as a governing force. It is the implementation of a just system where the power of the case for truth prevails over tribal whims. The logistical elements mentioned in the text, such as the known months and specific locations, serve as the essential protocol for this governance. Just as any high-level assembly requires a set time and place to operate effectively, these temporal and spatial markers provide the order and sanctuary needed for individuals to gather and witness these benefits. The physical journey is the vehicle, and the establishment of an argument for justice is the destination. This provides the structure within which the dominance of law can be debated, refined, and applied. Crucially, this system is not a closed circuit for a specific religious group, but a universal invitation to humanity. The Quran repeatedly addresses this duty toward an-nas, all of mankind, rather than restricting it to Muslimin or Mu'mineen. By using this universal term, the text identifies the Hajj as a global summit for justice, rather than a sectarian ritual. It suggests that the hujjat, or the prevailing argument for a just society, belongs to every human being. This reinforces the idea that the establishment of divine law is meant to serve the collective welfare of the world, offering a platform for any person to participate in the dominance of truth over oppression. Umrah then serves as the vital counterpart to this legal dominance. Rooted in the concept of AMR, it relates to inhabitation, the flourishing of a place, and the act of building something that endures. While Hajj establishes the legal and defensive framework, Umrah describes the constructive, civilizational activity that makes a society thrive and remain alive. When the text pairs these two, it presents a vision of a complete society. The forceful establishment of just governance on one side, and the flourishing development of a prosperous community on the other. It is the marriage of law and mercy, ensuring that the dominance of truth leads directly to the prosperity of all people. The word Mecca appears exactly once in chapter 48, verse 24. If God wanted to say Mecca in chapter 2, verse 196, God would have said Mecca. God does not forget. Chapter 20, verse 52 reminds us of exactly that. The Lord does not forget. So when God chose to write Masjid al-Haram instead of Mecca, that choice was deliberate. And the translation of Masjid al-Haram is not Mecca, it is the sacred mosque, or more precisely, the restricted, bounded, sanctified system of God's law. Because across the Quran, God uses many names for the same reality. A lamp, a light, the criterion, the Quran, the word. These are all descriptions of the same thing. His guidance, his law. Now look at who verse 196 is addressed to regarding those for whom the established system is not accessible, for whom the full implementation is not yet possible. What is their instruction? To hold firm, to maintain the mission, to not abandon what they have been set on. And yet traditional interpreters spend enormous energy trying to reconcile this passage with a physical pilgrimage itinerary, bending its meaning into fasting schedules, travel logistics, head-shaving rituals, and animal sacrifice sequences. So many brackets added by translators, so many explanatory footnotes just to make it fit the narrative. But here is a question the traditional interpretation cannot answer, and it comes from the traditional interpretation itself. It tells us this verse was revealed in the 6th year of Hijri, when the messenger and his companions were stopped and prevented from proceeding toward Mecca. Blocked, unable to move forward. If that is the context, then how exactly were the animals supposed to go forward while the people were held back? Who was sending them? Where were they going? And after that singular incident, this specific scenario of being stopped mid-journey and sending sacrificial animals ahead has not occurred once in 1400 years of Islamic history. Which means, by the traditional reading, this verse has been practically inapplicable for 14 centuries. A verse in a book God described as complete, detailed, and neglecting nothing, sitting unused and unworkable for 1400 years. We know the traditionalists will claim that there is a narration that claims he, the prophet, ordered that the animals be sacrificed there itself, but that then contradicts what the traditional meaning of the verse is saying. You can't have it both ways. So what is the verse actually communicating? When you are blocked, when the path toward what you are working to establish is being obstructed by those who oppose it, you send forward whatever guidance you have already set in motion. And not one word of the specific ritual architecture, the tradition built around this, the specific valley, the specific days, the specific sequence of acts, the penalty payments in animal equivalents for performing them in the wrong order, is anywhere in the book God called complete. That entire structure came from somewhere else. And that somewhere else is exactly where this video is going. Because here is what the Quran does and does not say about Hajj. It does not mention circling a building 7 times. It does not mention running between 2 hills 7 times. It does not mention throwing pebbles at a pillar. It does not mention slaughtering an animal at a specific valley at a specific time as a mandatory ritual act of worship. It does not mention touching or kissing a black stone. It does not mention a specific ihram garment. And where it does mention something resembling a ritual act, like the reference to shaving of the head in this verse, it provides none of the elaborate architecture, the tradition built around it, none of the specific locations, none of the specific sequences, none of the specific penalties for performing it in the wrong order. And if we accept the traditional meaning here, then about how much hair constitutes a valid shave? And why are women exempt from shaving their heads? The verse says nothing about only men shaving their heads, so women also need to shave their heads. And why do women also not wear the ihram? Why only men? That entire apparatus is absent. The Quran gives a word. The institution built an industry around that word. And the question we are asking is where that industry actually came from. Because the evidence points somewhere very specific, somewhere much older than Islam. Somewhere the people running that industry have very strong financial reasons to never discuss. So where did all of these rituals come from? Because someone built them, someone codified them, someone declared them obligatory. And the answer to where they came from is the same answer the previous documentary gave for the building itself. They are embedded in history, in archaeology. Let's start with Tawaf, the circumambulation, the circling of the Kaaba 7 times in a counterclockwise direction. This is treated as the central act of the pilgrimage, the most sacred movement a pilgrim performs. And it is, archaeologically and historically, one of the oldest attested religious behaviors in the Arabian Peninsula and across the ancient Near East. The practice of circumambulation around a sacred stone or sacred enclosure is documented across the pre-Islamic world with a clarity that requires no interpretation. The rival Kaabas that we previously examined, the Kaaba of Al-Lat in Taif, the Yemeni Kaaba of Dul Khalasa, the Kaaba of Gaiman with its red stone, pilgrims at all of these sites performed Tawaf. They circled, they moved around the sacred center. This was not an Islamic innovation. This was, as Ibn al-Kalbi documented in the Kitab al-Asnam, the standard way that pre-Islamic Arabs interacted with sacred stone structures. The movement was the ritual. The circling was the worship. And it predated Islam by centuries at minimum, and by millennia, if we follow the architectural evidence back to the Mustatils. Previously, we looked at the structural comparison between the Mustatil and the Kaaba was laid out with precision. Elongated rectangular enclosure, open to the sky. Sacred stone at the focal point, aligned to water, seasonal communal gathering, animal sacrifice. Every single feature matching. But there was one feature of the Mustatil ritual that deserves more attention here, the processional movement. The Mustatils were not static worship sites. They were movement-based. The ritual architecture demanded that the worshipper travel through space toward the sacred focal point. The elongated courtyard was a processional corridor. The act of moving, of walking, of traversing the distance between the threshold and the sacred center, this was built into the structure itself. Circumambulation is the logical evolution of this. When the processional architecture is replaced by a freestanding stone structure, when the elongated rectangle is compressed into a cube, the linear procession becomes a circular one. And the circling was done naked in pre-Islamic Arabia. This is documented not as an obscure detail, but as a standard feature of the pre-Islamic Tawaf. Pilgrims at the ancient Kaabas, including the Meccan one, circled the structure without clothing, as an act of ritual purity, a symbolic shedding of the worldly self before the divine. Even within the Hadith literature, which is human writing and carries no divine authority, there are accounts of this practice being common before the Quranic revelation. The practice was not eliminated immediately. The behavior was retained, the theological framing was adjusted. Now there is an entire chapter in the Quran called Hajj, and surely we must see the details of the traditional Hajj in there, right? Let's look at it. The opening verses start by talking about a staggering description of the last hour, emphasizing that the earthquake of that day will be unlike anything humanity has ever witnessed. This sets a tone of ultimate accountability, framing the entire chapter around the Hujjat of Allah, the prevailing argument for truth, rather than a travel itinerary. Traditional interpreters look at verses 26 through 29 and see divine authorization for the specific rituals of the physical pilgrimage in Mecca. But examine what the passage actually says and what it does not say. It mentions announcing the pilgrimage and people coming from distant places. It mentions mentioning God's name over grazing livestock and feeding the poor. It mentions ending untidiness, which is a general term for completing a process of purification or simplification, not a specific head-shaving ritual. It even uses the word yatawafu, which in chapter 24 describes those who move about among you, not people going around a building anti-clockwise 7 times. Then there is the ancient house, or al-Bayt al-Atiq. Atiq means ancient, free, or emancipated. It is not a proper noun referring to a specific building in a specific valley. While chapter 3 mentions a house established at Bakka, this is a different word entirely from the Mecca that appears once in chapter 48. The traditional response, that Bakka and Mecca are the same place, is asserted by human commentators without Quranic evidence to bridge the inconsistencies. The Tawaf commanded around the ancient house, even if we accept for the sake of argument that this refers to a physical structure, is not described with any of the specific ritual details that define the actual Tawaf performed today. 7 circuits, counterclockwise direction. The specific pace changes at specific points. The touching or kissing of the black stone at the start of each circuit. The specific prayers recited at specific stations. None of this is in the Quran. All of it is in the Hadith literature. Human writing. Books assembled 2 and 3 centuries after the prophetic period by fallible scholars who themselves acknowledged, repeatedly, the catastrophic levels of fabrication within their own collections. Even within that literature, without granting it any divine authority, the accounts of how the Prophet performed the Tawaf are contested, varied, and in places internally contradictory. Now go to Safa and Marwa. Chapter 2, verse 158. Indeed, Safa and Marwa are among the symbols of God. So whoever makes Hajj to the house or performs Umrah, there is no blame upon him for walking between them. And whoever volunteers good, then indeed God is appreciative and knowing. Safa and Marwa were associated with specific pre-Islamic deities. Isaf was venerated at Safa, Naila was venerated at Marwa. These were idols, sacred markers. The early Muslim community, coming out of a context where these two landmarks were pagan ritual sites, were disgusted by this, given their pagan associations. Because there is something about Safa and Marwa that goes deeper than even their pre-Islamic idol associations. Much deeper. Safa and Marwa are not hills in the conventional sense. They are massive, elongated stone formations at opposite ends of a space. One at the base, one at the head, a long distance between them. And pilgrims traverse that distance back and forth 7 times in a ritualized movement between 2 stone terminals. If you watched the previous documentary, you know exactly what that description matches. A mustatil, the head and the base of a Neolithic rectangular ritual enclosure. The long processional movement between the 2 terminal stone platforms. The specific type of ritualized traversal between 2 endpoints that the mustatil architecture was designed to produce. What pass off as Safa and Marwa may not be hills at all in their original archaeological significance. They may be the surviving terminal structures of a mustatil that once enclosed the entire space, now occupied by the Masjid al-Haram complex. The connecting walls are gone. The centuries of construction and demolition and rebuilding of the Meccan sanctuary have buried or destroyed whatever connected them. But the 2 terminal stones remain, and the ritual movement between them remains, as it has for 7,000 years. A possible explanation as to why Safa and Marwa feel so disconnected from the Kaaba. They likely belong to 2 entirely different archaeological eras and 2 different types of ritual architecture that were forced together for the sake of centralized religious authority and the pilgrimage economy. So to cover this up, they borrowed a story from the Bible, embellished it, and attached to the ritual. Abraham allegedly abandoning his wife Hagar and an infant Ismail in a barren, waterless valley. Her desperate running between 2 rocky outcrops searching for water. The miraculous sprouting of the Zamzam well beneath the feet of a dying child. It is a powerful story. Emotionally, it works perfectly, which is exactly why it was chosen. But search the entire Quran for Hagar. Search it for this story. Search it for Ismail being left in a valley. Search it for the Zamzam well. None of it is there. Not a word. The most emotionally compelling origin story attached to the second most performed ritual of the pilgrimage exists entirely outside the book, God called complete and detailed. It lives exclusively in the Hadith literature, written by men, centuries later, serving a system that needed that space between those 2 stones to feel sacred. Now let's look at the shaving of the head. In the traditions of ancient Semitic religions, the shaving of the head was associated with purification rites, with the completion of vows, with the crossing of thresholds between ordinary and sacred states. The Nazirite vow in the Hebrew tradition involved, at its completion, the shaving of the head and the offering of the hair as a sacrificial act. In ancient Egyptian religious practice, priests shaved their heads as markers of their separation from the ordinary world. In the traditions documented across South Asian religious practice, the Mundan ceremony, the first shaving of a child's head, carries explicitly the same theoretical framework. The hair of this life contains the residue of past impurity. The shaving removes it. The head shaving upon entry into monastic life in Buddhist practice represents the shedding of worldly identity and ego. Unlike others that bend facts to fit a narrative, we have to be honest. Yes, chapter 2, verse 196 mentions shaving the head. But the root HLQ appears only 3 times in the entire Quran. Twice it is linked to these alleged pilgrimage contexts, but the 3rd time, in chapter 56, it refers to the throat or windpipe, al-hulkum. This is a vital clue. The root carries a meaning of circularity or a hollow passage. In the context of chapter 2, which focuses on justice and the implementation of divine law, a detour into personal grooming feels out of place. There is a high probability this language carries a functional meaning regarding the completion of a process rather than a physical razor. We won't invent an explanation just to fill the gap. At this point, we cannot tell you with absolute certainty what that specific meaning is. We would rather leave a question mark than offer a fabrication. But if these specific physical acts aren't defined in the book, why are they so central to the faith? The answer lies in a human religious instinct so widespread and so ancient that its presence in any single tradition tells us nothing about divine command and everything about the deep grammar of human religious behavior. When the pilgrimage rituals were being codified, this behavior was already embedded in the cultural and religious life of the entire region. It was too old and too deep to remove, so it was not removed. It was given a new story, and the new story was written not in the Quran, but in the Hadith books. Even within those human-authored books, the legal scholars could not fully agree on who was required to shave, how much hair constituted a valid shave, what the penalty was for shaving at the wrong moment or in the wrong sequence, whether women were required to shave or merely to cut a symbolic amount. Centuries of legal disputation over the details of a ritual that God supposedly mandated in his complete and detailed book, but somehow forgot to mention there. The scholar in the transcripts made a precise and devastating point about this. The entire apparatus of legal rulings about head shaving, who must do it, when, how much, what the penalty is for errors. This is the religious leadership using complexity and specialized knowledge as a form of control. The ordinary believer cannot navigate this maze alone. They need the scholar. They need the cleric. They need someone to tell them whether their dam, their penalty payment, is required or waived. And the animal to be slaughtered as a penalty brings us to the next ritual. Animal sacrifice. The slaughter at Mina. Eid al-Adha. The global act of ritual slaughter that accompanies the pilgrimage season and is performed by Muslims worldwide who are not even physically present in Mecca. This is treated as one of the most theologically significant acts in the Islamic calendar, tied to the story of Abraham and his willingness to sacrifice his son, replaced at the last moment by an animal sent from God. And in the Quran, chapter 22, verse 37 says with stunning directness, "Their meat will not reach God, nor will their blood, but what reaches him is piety from you." The Quran itself, in the context of discussing animal offerings in the pilgrimage passage, explicitly states that the animal does not reach God. The meat does not reach God. The blood does not reach God. The act of slaughter is not what matters. What matters is the piety, the God consciousness, the taqwa. If God took the time to specifically clarify that the animal sacrifice is not what reaches him, what does that tell us about a religious system that has built an entire global industry around the physical act of slaughter? That deploys millions of animals every year at Eid al-Adha. That calculates penalties in animal equivalents. That requires the slaughter as a mandatory component of the Hajj itinerary. God said the blood does not reach him. The institution said, more blood, larger sacrifices, better documented slaughter certificates, global logistics networks to distribute the meat, penalty charges for ritual errors payable in animal equivalents. It is found in virtually every ancient sacrificial tradition across the ancient Near East. It is the signature of the pre-Islamic Mustatil ritual, where thousands of animal bones, carefully placed, were found around the upright sacred stones. Sacrifice at the stone, as old as the stones themselves. And this is precisely why God in the Quran specifically forbids the consumption of any animal sacrificed upon an altar or a sacred stone. Not because the act of slaughter itself is forbidden, but because God is drawing a direct line between ritual slaughter at sacred sites and the ancient pagan tradition it belongs to. The prohibition is not incidental. Its target audience knew exactly what Allah was prohibiting and why. Now the stoning. Rami al-Jamarat. The throwing of pebbles at 3 pillars in the valley of Mina. This is described in the tradition as a reenactment of Abraham's rejection of the devil at 3 specific points in the valley. Each pillar represents a moment where the devil appeared and Abraham drove him away with stones. Pilgrims throw 7 pebbles at each pillar over the course of the pilgrimage days, reciting the takbir with each throw. And in the Quran? Nothing. Not a word about throwing stones at pillars. Not a word about Mina as a site of specific ritual acts. Not a word about the devil appearing to Abraham in this valley and being repelled with pebbles. The narrative does not exist in the Quran, but it exists in the ground. Because what the word Jamar actually means, at its root, is a small pebble or a collection of small stones, a heap, a cairn, the physical reality of a stone pile. And the pre-Islamic practice of casting stones at certain landmarks in the Arabian Peninsula is documented as an apotropaic ritual, a protective act, a way of warding off the malevolent forces believed to inhabit certain geographical bottlenecks. The narrow passes of Mina, the specific topography of that valley, made it a place associated in pre-Islamic tribal understanding with the kind of dangerous liminal zone where unseen forces were present and where symbolic acts of protection were necessary. These pillars were, in their archaeological and cultural reality, ansab, sacred standing stones, betels. Usually in threes, the size and grouping of these indicated their authority and role inside the group. The same category of sacred stone that stands at the heart of the Mustatil that anchored the rival Kaabas across pre-Islamic Arabia, that is the oldest documented form of Arabian sacred architecture. People cast stones at them, not to reject them, but to acknowledge them, to pay them tribute, to ward off their potentially hostile power by the act of ritual engagement. When the new monotheistic framework arrived, this behavior could not simply be commanded to stop. It was too deeply embedded in the tribal memory of the region, too connected to the specific geography of the pilgrimage routes, too integrated into the economic and cultural calendar of the communities that passed through Mina. So it was not stopped, it was inverted. The sacred stones became the devil. The act of throwing became rejection rather than tribute. The behavior was preserved entirely. The theological meaning was reversed entirely. This is the exact pattern identified earlier as the hardware and software distinction. The physical behavior is the ancient hardware. The monotheistic narrative is the new software installed on top of it. The machine keeps running. The output is the same. Only the story told about why you are running it has changed. And this rebranding served a purpose beyond mere theological tidiness. Because if the stoning ritual were removed, there would be no mandatory reason for millions of pilgrims to funnel into the specific, crowded, commercially significant valley of Mina. The geographical anchor of the pilgrimage depends on the ritual. Remove the ritual and the geography loses its sacred necessity. Keep the ritual and the geography remains essential. The revenue model requires the ritual, so the ritual was kept, the story was changed, the bills kept getting paid. Now bring all of this together. Because this is not a collection of separate observations, it is a system. And the system has been running continuously for 7,000 years. The Mustatil builders walked to their sacred rectangle, crossed the threshold, moved through the processional courtyard, arrived at the sacred stone, and performed their animal sacrifice. Their descendants, across the Bronze Age and Iron Age of the Arabian Peninsula, maintained the essential structure of this while adapting its specific forms to changing political and cultural conditions. Multiple Kaabas emerged, multiple sacred stones, multiple Tawaf circuits, multiple pilgrimage economies, the black stone, the white stone, the red stone, all doing the same thing, all running the same ritual hardware. Then came a moment of extraordinary political and commercial consolidation. One Kaaba eliminated the others. The competitive sacred landscape of Arabia was unified under a single site, a single stone, a single set of rituals. And the arrival of Islam presented a great opportunity for consolidation. So a new story was made. A story that used Islam's ironclad instance of monotheism, made the one remaining sacred center appear not as the survivor of a commercial competition, but as the uniquely and eternally appointed house of the one God, when they attached their own interpretations to the Quranic text. A story that made its specific rituals appear not as the inherited behaviors of a Neolithic cattle-herding culture, but as the divinely mandated acts of Abrahamic faith. A story that made questioning any of this not merely incorrect, but spiritually dangerous. And that story was written, not in the Quran, in the books of men, the biographical literature about the Prophet, the Hadith collections, the legal commentaries, the interpretive frameworks that told you what the Quran meant when it did not say what the institution needed it to say. These books were written under the patronage of political rulers who derived their legitimacy from their connection to the Meccan sanctuary. They were written in the courts and scholarly institutions of the early caliphates. They were written by people who had profound personal, professional, and financial interests in particular conclusions being reached. And then those conclusions were placed over the Quran like a lens, and generations of believers were taught to read the Quran through that lens rather than reading it as God described it. Complete, detailed, neglecting nothing. The pilgrimage rituals are not derived from the Quran. They are derived from Hadith literature that the tradition's own scholars debated, questioned, and in significant portions identified as fabricated. They are derived from a pre-Islamic ritual landscape that the archaeological record now allows us to trace back 7,000 years with increasing precision. They are maintained by a political and commercial apparatus that generates billions annually from the sincere faith of people who have been told with complete confidence that God commanded every single movement they are making. God did not say in his book, "Circle this building 7 times." God did not say, "Run between these 2 hills 7 times." God did not say, "Shave your head at this specific point in this specific sequence." God did not say, "Throw 7 pebbles at each of these 3 pillars on these specific days." God did not say, "Slaughter an animal at this specific location as a mandatory act of worship that I will count for you." God did not mention the black stone. God did not command the ihram garments in their specific form. God did not establish a pilgrimage package pricing structure or a national quota system. The system is not from that God. The system is from 7,000 years of sacred commerce, ritual inheritance, and the political management of human spiritual need. It is old, it is deeply embedded, it is enormously profitable, and it is, from every direction that the evidence approaches it, something other than what it claims to be. Read the book. Read it as God described it, complete, detailed, neglecting nothing. Read it without the interpretive lens ground by the institutions that benefit from a particular reading. Ask what is in it. Ask what is not in it. Ask why what is not in it became the centerpiece of the religion. Ask why God would perfect and complete a religion and leave out its most expensive and physically demanding obligation. Ask why the rituals that fill in that absence match with archaeological precision a 7,000-year-old pagan ritual landscape that predates Abraham, predates Moses, predates every prophet the tradition acknowledges. Those questions are not the questions of someone leaving faith. They are the questions demanded by the book itself. By the God who said, "Do you not think?" By the God who said, "Will you not reason?" By the God who said, "Is it not enough that we have sent down to you the book recited to them?" By the God who described his own book as complete and detailed and neglecting nothing and then left it in your hands. The stone has been standing for 7,000 years. The question is whether it is what you were told it is. Read the book. It will tell you.